There was a man out water skiing one day, and as they came around a turn, he wiped out. And as the boat went around and was turning around to come back, the man looked over, and there in the reeds there was a boat. And he noticed there's a man with a gun duck hunting. And he was joking around. The guy in the water raised his hands. He said, "Don't shoot." And the guy in the boat looked at him and said, "Don't quack." Sooner or later, in some way, shape, or form, we all come face to face with our own mortality. So something that I'm doing today that's a little bit different. I've thought about doing this for a long time. Instead of a sermon, it's more instructive. It's more of a not a how-to, but a hey, you need to think about this. If you normally don't take notes, today is a good day to take notes. That's why in your bulletin I included, I don't always do this. Pastor Mark is better at this than I am, but there's a page to take notes on. This was not by design, but it occurred to me the other day. Last week, we attended a wedding at Cana. And this week, we attend a funeral in Bethany. When I meet with couples to talk about their wedding, I tell them there are 2 times in your life, 2 days when it's all about you. 2 days when people will mark their calendar and come be with you on that day. And the first is your wedding. And you can guess what the second day is. But today, I'm not going to talk about the funeral for Lazarus as much as I want you to think about your own funeral. And I know that's not easy. It sounds a little odd, but I encourage you to think about 2 aspects of your funeral: the service itself and the people in the first few rows. And the question that I want you to think about today and actively think about is what do you want at your funeral? If you want a gospel song sung, say so. If you want MacArthur Park sung, I don't know why you would, say so. Make your wishes known. That's the whole point. Now, what's prompted this? Well, like I said, I've thought about this for a long time. I don't know why it just said this is the day to do it. I was thinking about 24 years of ministry. But what I know, that people at a funeral are more open to questions of life, more open to the gospel message, certainly more so at a funeral than they are at a wedding. I've had the privilege of walking with families during the darkest days of their lives. I did a service in Kokomo for Gavin, who lived just a few days. I led a service for a 35-year young father of 3 young children in a packed funeral home parlor, a standing room only, of a group of people who were searching for answers. The largest was in Bremen for a community staple in that town. Every available seat, every available chair that we had was brought into the sanctuary for that service, for Jim's service. I was the third of 3 pastors speaking at that service. The family, for Jim's favorite drink was chocolate milk, so the family special ordered 500 small containers of chocolate milk for those visiting at the funeral home. They ran out long before the visitation was over. You probably know people like that. The smallest I've been thinking about this. The smallest was at a chapel in a nursing home in Michigan, or not Michigan City, but East Chicago, for a 98-year-old woman who literally outlived her family and outlived her friends. There were 6 people there. And so I rearranged the seats in a circle, and we prayed, and we told stories, and we laughed, and we cried. And yes, here's what really has prompted this. I've led more than my fair share of funeral services where the tension in the room was palpable. Not because of anything that the deceased person, the person that they were there to honor has done, but because the family just doesn't want to be in the same room. Quite frankly, to be honest with you, the instructions from them was, Pastor, we just want to get through this. And because there's no instructions from their father or mother or uncle or the person they're there to honor, I struggle with that. And so I'm giving you permission, actually I'm pleading with you to plan your own funeral and make those plans known. Many of you know my dad was a pastor for over 60 years. He died at the age of 91, and for several years he told his boys, yeah, there's a file there on my desk with all the plans. When my time comes, it's right there. Well, the plans were for the funeral home and for his casket and where to be buried. There was nothing about the service itself. My mother, God rest her soul, on the other hand, brought out this thick file and said, here's my plans for the funeral, everything in detail, including the instruction to pay the organist more of an honorarium because some of the pieces that she selected are pretty complicated. And that was a great gift to us. People worry about leaving something for their children. And that's a legitimate worry, but something that will bring comfort and alleviate tension to your family is to leave instructions for your funeral. Don't assume that people know what you want. Again, that my experience is that regardless of the age, regardless of the situation, regardless of whether someone was sick for a long time and death was somewhat expected, or it was very sudden, when I walk into the room to meet with a family, the most common emotion is just numb. When Jesus arrived in Bethany, Mary and Martha were still numb with grief. Here we have a scriptural definition of grief. Grief is real. It's raw. But understand that grief is only possible because of love. We don't grieve that which we don't love. That's just the way we're wired. We pastors, we like to say all the time, be like Jesus. And so here's a great model on how we can be like Jesus. What did Jesus do when he walked into the situation? We're told this. When Jesus saw Mary weeping and the Jews who came with her also weeping, what happened? He was greatly disturbed in spirit and greatly moved. And he began to weep. This is John 11:35 is not only what's called the shortest verse in the Bible, but most possibly the most powerful. Jesus enters into our sorrow. In the midst of our deepest sorrow, our most intense pain, and even in the midst of our doubt, Jesus is not disconnected from our human condition, but enters into our sorrow and cries with us. Grief is every bit a part of a funeral, just as much as humor is. You know, I've discovered that's what's consistent in almost every funeral, including the funeral I led for Gavin, is that the presence, the healing presence of tears, but also the healing power of laughter. Both are appropriate. So what I really want to encourage you to do is leave instructions and go over it with your family. Psalm 90 is a psalm about human frailty in light of God's greatness. And verse 12 says this, "So teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom." Not a head of wisdom, but that wisdom flows through the heart. There is no guarantee of tomorrow. There's a couple resources that I want to lift up to you, especially if you're younger, if you're a parent, if you're a teacher, or if you're a grandparent. There's a great website called setpath.org, and it's actually geared for teenagers or younger adults to literally set the path of their life. Another great resource is a newer book by Daniel Harkavy and Michael Hyatt. It's titled Living Forward. And it basically says the same thing. Plan your path. How many of you read Stephen Covey's classic work? And it starts with the same premise. It's really to begin with the end in mind. The only difference is the end that we're thinking about is our own. And we need to be okay with that. And the first question really is what do I want at the funeral? That's not an uplifting question. Maybe it's not a question that you thought about coming in this morning. But if you think about it and provide the answer for your family and go over it with them and with your pastor, it's a great gift. So we have two elements. We have the funeral itself and the people in the first few rows. So what about the funeral? Let's start with the funeral home. See, this is a little bit different than a sermon, isn't it? It feels odd to me, but selecting a funeral home, it's important. Select one that you know who you're dealing with, someone that you're comfortable with. And again, I'm speaking out of my own experience, but it's always a great comfort to me. I found over the years consistently, I love the idea that when I call a funeral home or when I deal with a funeral home, I'm dealing with the owner. And we have three great funeral homes where the owners are local. We can't always say that. I've dealt with corporate-owned funeral homes, and there's a difference. So find someone that you're comfortable with. And the question is, do you want your funeral at the funeral home or at the church? It's an important question. What about music? Not every family is musical. Not every family, if when I talk about hymns, would you like to sing a hymn at Dad's funeral if the eyes bug out like that? Well, it's up to you. But there might be somebody in the family that wants to sing a solo or play an instrument. Think about what you want as far as instrumentalists. Something, of course, and I'm speaking at a Christian funeral, something that's appropriate, please. I mean, you're sitting here in a church, I assume that what you want is appropriate. What about Scripture? Something that reflects your faith. And even I would encourage you to write down a notation of why this Scripture is important to you. One of the really neat things, I mean, death is never neat, but after my dad passed away and we started going through his Bibles, the notes that were in his Bible, that's a great gift. But to share with your family, here's the Scripture that I want. at my funeral, and here's why, that's a great gift. It tells your story. Years ago, I assisted, it's when I was an associate pastor, but there was a man named Bob, his wife died. And when we met with him, his wife and he both had the same scripture in mind for their funeral. But here was Bob's instructions. He said, Pastor, use John 3:16 and preach the gospel, and at the end, give an invitation because my family needs to hear it. Those are great instructions. What about poems or readings that reflect your life and your faith? I'll tell you, the most common over the years is Footprints in the Sand, but I've used others. But more than once, Footprints in the Sand has bailed me out when the family doesn't give me much of anything. And I hope your family would have lots of stories to tell. What about honors, military honors? And that this goes beyond just military honors. If you're part of the Masonic Lodge or Daughters of the American Revolution, Sons of the American Revolution, they have their own short service that can be part of your funeral. So think about that. And this last one, I'm using an industry term, so please forgive me. It's not crude. It's just the word that is used, and that's disposal. Do you want to be buried? Do you want to be cremated? That's your decision. The point is, have a plan and make that plan known. Because I have found where people make an assumptive mistake is that they make pre-arrangements with the funeral home, but that's for what happens at the funeral home. They don't talk about what happens at the funeral. They don't talk to you about who's going to speak. They don't talk about the details that we just covered here. So what about the second element? What about the people in the reserved pews? At every service, there are a few rows up front that is reserved for the family. Well, that's one of the things we talk about. I talk about with the funeral director. How many rows do we need to have reserved up front? Because you may not worry too much about what the people in the room think about you, but I can promise you this, you care deeply about the people in the first few rows. You care deeply about the people in the reserved pews. These are the most important people in your life. And so what are they going to say about you? Pastor Mike Heinbaugh, he was my mom's pastor, mom and dad's pastor when mom passed away. And he did something really neat involving the people in the reserved pews. He asked my daughter Shannon, gave her a pad of paper and said, at the visitation, here's what I'm asking you to do. And she agreed to do it. But go to your grandma's sisters and nieces and nephews and ask them about your grandma. Ask them to share a story about your grandma. And she did. And she wrote them down. And then her task at the funeral was to get up and share what she learned. And she told some great stories that I hadn't heard. None of them bad, obviously. But what would the most important people in your life say about you if your funeral were held tomorrow? Write it out. Because we all have stories. We know we do. We all have stories of people in our lives who have walked away and we never see them again. You know, maybe I haven't told you anything that you already haven't thought about today. But if you have this planned out, you are in the distinct minority, the 1% or less who do. And so real quick, just some mistakes to avoid. And that's waiting until I'm older. How many things are you waiting to do until you're older? A lot. Do it when you have time. Do it when you have time to think through it without the pressure of time and health. And I know it's not easy, but I guarantee you, when you have this conversation with your family, with your loved ones, they will thank you. The second thing is not setting a budget. Last week we talked about the cost of marriage. The cost of funerals is expensive. One person last week after the service, they tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Pastor, if you think getting married is expensive, try getting divorced." That's expensive. And finally, it's just not sharing your plans. Your family, your executor, your pastor want to know what your wishes are. Jesus said that none of us know the time or the hour. And so maybe the first decision to make is to look into your own heart. When we count our days, our thoughts, our decisions are filtered first through the heart. It's often been said that funerals are for the living, they're not for the dead. And that's true. Our hearts need time to review, to reflect and mourn. Because in that moment, we are rudely reminded of our own mortality. That our days really are numbered. But we worship a God who knows that number. We worship a God who Scripture says knows how many hairs we have on our head. The gospel writer John may have included this story of Jesus weeping because it went against the prevailing Greek philosophy of the day. For the Greeks, to show emotion was to display weakness. And so by extension, what the Greeks said was we serve an impersonal God. If God is all powerful, then God is isolated from our grief. God cannot display weakness. God cannot display passion or compassion. But we find here a very different picture of God in John's gospel when Jesus weeps. Here we find the reality of a God whose heart feels anguish and compassion for his people. Jesus came to share the good news of a God who cares passionately and compassionately for his people. And our response is to care passionately and compassionately for those around us.